It all began about a year after I married Oscar Higgins. Oscar was twice my age, but his bank account showed 6 figures. So I made a play for him. Finally, I got him to propose to me, and I gladly accepted. I didn't love him. I was only interested in security. Then it happened. As I said, it was about a year after he brought me to his isolated house. Oscar had a heart attack. "Will he be all right, doctor?" I asked. "Can't say for sure, Frida," the doctor replied. "I've done all I can. We can only wait and see. Honestly, he should be in a hospital, but I'm afraid moving him into town over those bad roads might kill him." Oscar had always had a bad heart, one of the reasons I married him. I figured he might die at any moment, and then his money would be mine. Although I acted upset, I sincerely hoped he wouldn't survive. "How is he today, doctor?" "Bad news, Frida. It's going to be pretty tough on you from now on," he said, his face dark with concern. I felt panicked. Something was wrong, but what? "Tough? I don't understand," I said. "Your husband's heart attack left him completely paralyzed, Frida. He has absolutely no control over his muscles. He'll be bedridden for the rest of his life." At first, I was shocked, but as the days passed, I fully realized what Oscar's condition meant for me. He was like a baby, completely helpless. Oscar couldn't even talk to tell me what he wanted or needed. All he could do was open his mouth and choke out guttural sounds. "Just a minute, Oscar," I'd say, trying to guess. He had no friends, and living in that isolated house didn't help. There were no neighbors for miles. I had no one to talk to. I was alone with my darling, helpless husband. "I'm sorry, Oscar. I don't understand you." Oscar could hear me, but if he needed something, I had to run down a list until I guessed right. "Are you thirsty, Oscar? Sleepy? Hungry?" I couldn't leave him, not even for an hour. Once a week, I rushed into town to shop. When I returned, I'd usually have to clean him up. Oh Lord, how much more can I stand? I became his full-time nurse. I had to wash him, shave him, feed him. "Keep it in your mouth, you blabbering idiot!" I'd snap. Living with him was like living with an imbecile. It went on like that for a year. I thought I would lose my mind. "Why don't you die already? Why do you go on living day after day? Do you hear me? Die!" I screamed. Finally, I reached my breaking point. "I'm going out," I declared. "I haven't seen a movie since you got sick." "Well, I'm going tonight." He stared at me with those wide, pleading eyes. "You've been fed. You can last until I get back. Goodbye." That night, I drove into town and went to a movie. I felt a little better afterward. It did me good to get away from that isolated house. Except for occasional shopping trips, I had been cooped up there like a prisoner. "How were you while I was gone? All right? Well, get used to it, Buster. I'm going to do this often from now on." I leaned over him, tormenting him. "Maybe one night I'll go away and not come back. What would happen to you then, huh? You'd starve. You couldn't even get yourself a drink of water. You'd starve to death." Then, on one of those frequent escapes into town, I met Rick. He was big and handsome, and I was lonely. "There's a roadhouse a couple of miles out. We could dance a little," he suggested. "I'm willing. Let's go, Rick," I said. I saw Rick often. At first, it was just for laughs, but after a few dates, it got serious. "I love you, Frida. I need you," he said. "Oh, Rick, kiss me," I whispered. One night, I told Rick all about Oscar. He was angry with me for not telling him sooner. "You should have told me you were married, Frida," he said. "I was afraid, Rick," I replied. "I was afraid you wouldn't want to see me if you knew." After a while, he cooled off. "What are we going to do, honey?" he asked. "I can't divorce him, Rick. It would mean giving up his money," I said. "If he were to die, it would all be mine. Every cent. But I love you, Frida. I want to marry you." "Be patient, Rick, be patient. How long can he go on living like that?" And then the doctor told me the truth. "Your husband could live to a ripe old age with the kind of wonderful care he gets from you, Frida." I made up my mind. "We have to kill him, Rick. It's the only way." "No, Frida, not murder. It'll be easy, darling. It will look like an unfortunate accident. I have a plan." "All right," he said. "Let's hear it." The following day, a couple of men came to the house. "We're from the Ajax Construction Company." "Oh yes, come in," I said. I took them down into the cellar. "Right here. I want bars on every window. I'm so afraid of burglars and my husband is helpless." "Okay, lady, we got it," one of them said. "Come on, Rob, let's get to work." Next, I had them remove the old cellar door and replace it with a big, thick one. I'd like a snap lock installed, I added, so it locks by itself. Anything you say, lady. Finally, they put up some shelves. I want to store canned goods down here, sort of a pantry, I explained. Everything was set. I stocked the cellar pantry with canned meats, vegetables, and fruit juices. Later, Rick came over. Oscar just stared at us with his expressionless eyes, his mouth dribbling. You've got to help me clear the cellar of any tools Oscar might use to escape, I told Rick. Yeah, I get it, Frida, he said. Rick broke a couple of cellar windows and damaged the thick door to make it look realistic. Meanwhile, Oscar, the poor, slobbering fool, tried to figure out what was going on. The man who comes to read the electric meter in the cellar will be here in 3 weeks, I explained. He'll let me out. If I don't hear from you by then, come yourself. Rick kissed me right there in front of paralyzed, helpless Oscar. I thought Oscar's eyes would pop right out of his head. See you, Rick. Bye, honey, he said. After Rick left, I turned to my bedridden husband and mocked him. A terrible accident is going to happen now, Oscar. I'm going to get locked in the cellar, and you're going to starve to death. I went down into the cellar. The great, big new door clicked shut behind me, its snap lock sealing me in. I could hear Oscar's faint, guttural cries beyond it. I settled in for the long stay. Upstairs, as the days passed, Oscar's eerie, blood-curdling yells grew weaker and weaker. 4 days. 4 days without food or water. He ought to be dead by now. Finally, Oscar's howling stopped. Silence closed in. Meanwhile, I was living off the canned goods I had stored in the cellar. Cold meat wasn't gourmet, but it was better than nothing. After 3 weeks of waiting, growing more nervous each day, I heard the doorbell upstairs. Electric meter reader! Anybody home? Help! Help! I screamed, doing my best to act hysterical. When the meter reader let me out, I bawled like a baby. I've been locked in! My husband! My husband! Your husband is dead, lady. The police listened to my story. The door locked behind me. I couldn't get out. I was trapped. How come you had the windows barred, lady? They asked. I was afraid. My husband was helpless, and I was afraid of prowlers. I had the snap lock put on in case I forgot to lock it, but it locked me in. Take it easy, lady. I wept and wailed. I tried to escape. I yelled and screamed until I was hoarse. Poor Oscar. He was so helpless. It wasn't your fault, ma'am. It was an accident. You couldn't help it. The case was closed and I was cleared. I cleaned out the cellar, replaced the broken windows and locked it for good. I never wanted to go down there again. It would be a long time before I could forget those 3 weeks, listening to Oscar's fading cries as he slowly starved to death. Later, a lawyer handled my husband's estate. Since your husband left no will, Mrs. Higgins, it will take several months before the proceeds can be turned over to you. Do your best, Mr. Davidson. Rick and I met soon after it was all over. Everything was proper and raised no suspicion. Frida Higgins, this is Rick Lairdale. How do you do? Glad to meet you, Frida, Rick said. Rick was anxious to marry me, but I cautioned him. We've got to wait, Rick. People might talk. Okay, Frida, anything you say. Meanwhile, Mr. F. Davidson worked to settle Oscar's estate. Months passed. Finally, Rick and I were married. We stayed at the house. I hate this place, Rick. As soon as everything is settled, we'll sell it. Okay with me, he said. Then I got a call from New York. My lawyer needed me there to finalize the estate. I'll go with you, Frida. No, Rick, that wouldn't look right. I'd better go alone. I was gone for almost 4 days. When I returned, I called out, Rick, I'm home. Rick? I found him in the cellar, unconscious. His fists were bloody and raw from pounding on the door. He must have been searching for the canned goods I had removed. The door had locked behind him. He was almost dead from lack of food and water. My darling? My darling? I nursed Rick back to health, but something had happened to him while he was imprisoned in the cellar. His mind had snapped. He couldn't talk, couldn't move. He was paralyzed. He just lay there, staring. He was like a helpless baby. I had to feed him, wash him, shave him. He was completely out of his mind, a babbling idiot. Oscar, at least, could understand me when I spoke.